Good day, everybody. How are we doing today? Today we're going to be talking about the textbook, Chapter 2, American Experiments from 1521 to 1700. Now, the big idea, kind of the main focus I want you to have with this, is in what ways did European migrants transfer familiar patterns and institutions to their colonies in the Americas, and in what ways did they create new American worlds? How did Native Americans adapt to the growing presence of Europeans among them? So that's kind of an overall question, and I want you to be thinking about these answers as we go. We're going to start off today by talking about Spain's tribute colonies. Now, Spanish colonizers capitalized on pre-existing systems of tribute and labor discipline to tap into the enormous wealth of Mesoamerica and the Andes. So you have this trading, you have slavery, those types of things, and they are capitalizing on those. Once native rulers were overthrown, the Spanish monarchs transferred their institutions, their things that they had, councils, legal codes, the Catholic Church. These are all things that they brought to America. We also have a movement of plants and animals and diseases called the Columbian Exchange, and I'll show you a picture of that here in just a second. But basically what the Columbian Exchange is moving things from one country to another. So let me show you this image. So over here in the Americas, we have beans and chocolate and maize and peanuts and pineapples and potatoes and all these things getting sent over to Europe. In response, Europe and Africa and Asia have bananas and cattle and chickens and pigs and rice that they are sending back and forth. So now we are starting to trade between continents and large groups of people. Now, you also have groups of Spanish people that are explorers that are called conquistadors, and these conquistadors received what were called encomiendas, which is basically the ability to receive tribute or money in labor and goods from Indians. So they could be able to go and force the Indians to be able to do certain things for them. They found gold and silver in Mexico in the Andes Mountains, and they instituted native workers, so the native groups, Native Americans, early Indians, to be able to work in those mines. They started to trade these minerals to China, China to Europe, silks, spices, ceramics. We're starting to get more worldwide trade going on. We also have these things, mestizos, Spaniards and Indians, ethnicity. We have mulattoes, Spaniard and African American, Zambo, Indian and African populations. And so now we're starting to have these races interact and mingle even more one with another. Now, one of the things that the Columbian Exchange and this trading of goods from Spain was bringing over to Europe were diseases, things like smallpox and influenza and the measles and yellow fever. And the Native Americans here in the Americas had never experienced these before, and so when these diseases came over, they ravaged the Indian communities. They just killed thousands and thousands of Native Americans. Within the first 100 years of European and Indian contact, they're estimating that about 90% of the Indians or Native Americans died. Many of them were from these diseases that were coming over. There were foods that were also being transported between these two locations of Spain and Europe and the Americas. We have maize or corn. We have potatoes, manioc, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, and with these spread of goods became greater population growth. They also had animals that were being transported between one to another, and some of these animals and plants had germs and different things, but they were carrying between the 15th and 16th centuries to America. So you have cattle and swine and horses, oxen, chicken, honeybees, dandelions, and weeds that are now being transported to and from each other. Here we have a little graph that shows just how destructive the implementation or the introduction of European and some of their things were on the Native Americans. We can see by 1518 we're estimating about 25 million, and within less than 100 years that number is down to less than 2.5 million surviving Native Americans. Now, the Spanish, their explorers, they had some enemies, and Spain was the richest nation in Europe. King Philip II was the most powerful ruler in all of Europe, and Philip wanted the Catholic Church. So they went into this war for 15 years, and then you have King Henry English from England, the King Henry VIII. He wanted a divorce from his current wife, and the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, said no. So Henry, in response to that, started his own religion called the Church of England, and that religion that King Henry started allowed that divorce to happen. So what basically happened is you had King Philip sending ships against the English. Now you have Elizabeth the First to try to help restore the Catholic Church, trying to bring the Catholic Church back into England and back into its dominance. So here you have a picture of Philip on the left, Henry on the right, and don't they just look so noble? Now, you had these things called plantation colonies that these European countries were spreading out and taking over. So in Portugal, in Europe, had plantation colonies in Brazil. England in Europe had plantation colonies in Jamestown, Maryland. France had plantation colonies in the Caribbean islands. And kind of the reason for these was they needed more sugar. They needed more tobacco. And there were these great places to grow them, and so they were growing them in their plantation colonies and shipping them back. And this allowed for these colonies to be able to grow in larger numbers in Brazil and Jamestown and the Caribbean islands. So for instance, Portugal's Brazil sugar plantations, by the 1590s, there were over 1,000 sugar mills. And by 1620, there were no native Brazil Indians working them anymore. All the workers were slaves directly from Africa, and there you can kind of see a picture of them harvesting sugar. As far as America's colonies go, we have King James I in 1606 gave the Virginia Company of London land in America, and in 1607 they sent an all-male group to go look for gold and pearls and tribute in the Americas. Now that's obviously a problem if all you have are males coming over to search for things. You have Jamestown. Jamestown is swampy. There's no fresh water. They refused to plant crops because they were just focused on gold and the riches. And eventually it led to many of their deaths. 1611, we have 1,200 sent to the Americas. 50% of them die. You have the Indians and the colonists. They're trying to work together. In one instance of that is you have Powhatan. The Powhatan Indians, they arranged a marriage between their daughter Pocahontas and John Rolfe. So if you've ever seen the Disney movie, you might have a little bit of background on that. Tobacco in the American colonies became what's called a cash crop, a way for them to be able to make some serious money and be able to share it back with their homeland in England. James I said, speaking about tobacco, that it's a vile weed with its black, stinking fumes, and it's baleful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. Now that's interesting that James I said this hundreds of years ago about tobacco. Now, you have the House of Burgesses, which is kind of like the government, the setup over in England. In 1619, they make laws and start to levy taxes on the colonists, the people in the Americas, for these things that they are growing and selling. And here we can see a drawing of Jamestown, kind of triangular with a dock there for the boat. And then these are some pictures that I took a few years ago when I was able to go to Jamestown. Right up here, we can see some skins that they would grow. Right up here, we can see tobacco that is hanging and drying from the roofs. Over here, we can see some of the native huts for the Native Americans that lived close by. This lady down here, she is making a canoe. It's a very, very slow and slow process. And then here we can see one of the boats that would have been used to transport between England and Jamestown. Now, England tobacco colonies. You have the Indian War of 1622 versus the settlers. This is going to lead to later on conflict. You have the king finally and officially taking over. He established an appointed governor, elected assembly, formal legal system, and an established Anglican church within the American colonies, which is going to be a model for future royal colonies. By 1632, Maryland, the modern-day state of Maryland, became a refuge for Catholics who were being persecuted in England. So if you belonged to the Catholic Church in England, you weren't very well accepted, so they were running away to Maryland to be able to gain that religious freedom. It's kind of interesting. All the way back in 1632, the idea of religious freedom was important, and it continues on to this day. By 1646, we have the Toleration Act, which, if you look at the root word of toleration, it's tolerate, meaning to understand and respect other people. All Christians have the right to follow their beliefs and hold church services within the American colonies. Now, there was this thing called the headright system. And the headright system gave you 50 acres if you paid for someone to come to the colony of Virginia. It's a way to be able to get more people there. So let's say I have some extra money and I need some more land. And I got a friend named Billy who lives in England. And I'm going to say, Billy, I'm going to pay for you to come to America because that will then grant me 50 extra acres of land. By 1630, we here in the colonies were exporting 3 million pounds of different products, and by 1660, so 30 years later, that that export had jumped up to 10 million pounds. We also started out something else called indentured servitude. Now, we're all familiar with slavery, and we'll kind of talk about that here in a second, but indentured servitude is slightly different. What it is, let's say I have a friend named Johnny, or I'm looking for more workers, and so I'm going to go to England for either Johnny or for some other workers, and I will say, I will pay for you to come to the colonies, but you are required to work for me for 4 or 5 years. Then, after that time, you are free to marry whoever you'd like. You can go work your own job. You can do those types of things. But for me, paying your way, you are required to work. It was a great idea, got more people over here, but at the end, after their time, it didn't really work out well for them. Many of them were still in poverty, still extremely poor. Half of them died, whether it was on their journey over or once they got here. And by the time they were done, 25% of them still ended up without owning any land. So those are indentured servitude, and most of those predominantly were white. Here you have the African laborers. They just couldn't get enough indentured servants, so they were starting to require more and more slaves. Down in Barbados in 1661, Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of the Negroes. They're trying to establish more rules and procedures for having slaves. The price of tobacco fell, and so the white workers became too expensive. So the only way to be able to make money with tobacco is to buy slaves. Here we can see one of these villages. Okay, we can see them, their homes, their mom and dad and son and daughter working, and the different products that they are growing. Now, we also have some other colonies that are starting to play in. The Dutch and the French are starting to explore more. English sailors are going along the continent's northern coastline looking for that northwest passage to America. Remember, they wanted to be able to get to Asia through up north, but there's ice up there, north of Canada and different things. They never found it, but they liked the area, so they stayed. So here's a little map of where some of these people were going. We can see the blue is French, and that brownish is Spain and different things. By 1608, Samuel de Champlain explored the St. Lawrence River and Quebec into modern-day Canada. He traded with the natives, furs, and also taught them the Word of God. Few people came at the end of the world, was kind of the thought process, is that this area was the end of the world and not very many people would come. By 1681, you have Robert de la Salle, traveled Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, and he found Louisiana. Now, Dutch controlled the Atlantic trade in slaves and sugar. The Dutch had a lot of power. They controlled the Indian Ocean trade in spices and Chinese silks and ceramics. And by 1621, the Dutch government started New Netherland, which also became New Amsterdam, which had Manhattan, which is now modern-day New York. Now, these Dutch people, they were trading in fur with the Canadian Indians and native groups up there and around there. And the Dutch and the Indian were fighting, and ultimately that almost led to the end of this New Amsterdam colony, which is modern-day New York. You had the Iroquois Nation of Native Americans. They were kind of situated in between the French and the Dutch colonies, and they started to wage war on the Hurons, the Neutrals, the Erie, Susquehannocks, the Beaver Wars. So we're starting to get a war between these colonists and the native groups that have been here already. And here, right here on this map, we can kind of see that area in red where this war and these groups were fighting. That's a beaver in war. The Beaver Wars. Hope you get it. Here we can see another drawing of it. We can see the guns of the colonists versus the spears and the shields and different things of the natives. Now, the New England Colonies. These are more that we are going to be familiar with. 1620, 102 English Protestants landed at a place they called Plymouth. By 1640, there were 20,000. The families, Protestant principled communities, a lot of people had come over very, very quickly. Those original people were the Pilgrims. They were what are known as religious separatists. They didn't really agree with the Church of England and King James I, so they moved over to the Americas searching for religious freedom. They had their Mayflower boat, the boat Mayflower that hopefully you've learned in elementary school. And they also created something called the Mayflower Compact, which established self-governing religious congregations, and it ended up kind of being our model for a political structure within America. They were willing to help each other out and do those things because they knew they would need and rely upon everybody else in order to survive. This government, they had a representative of self-government, broad political rights, property ownership, and religious freedom within their community as they came aboard in Plymouth. Here we can kind of see a map. We can see the New England up top, then the Chesapeake colonies with the amount of people that are heading over that way. Now, for some other reading or for some other information, if you look at page 61 through 66 on your book, and just kind of research these topics a little bit, John Winthrop in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Roger Williams in Rhode Island, Anne Hutchinson, what their experience was with Rhode Island. You had the Puritan Revolution in England and Puritanism and witchcraft within the colonies. You might have heard of the Salem witch trials. And then you have a yeoman society. So if you look at 61 through 66, you'll be able to gain a deeper understanding of these four topics here. Now, there were some problems. Obviously, you have native groups, you have these colonists or Europeans coming over trying to take over, and so you started to get conflict between these. The control of resources, the natural resources, the water, the wood, the mines, the minerals that were being found. You know, whose possession are they? Legitimacy of colonial leaders' claims to power. Is these leaders who were coming over or sending representatives over, is it really their right to claim whatever as their own? Attempts to define social and cultural norms. Now you're in this new country and you're starting to establish new principles and rules, and you know, do you need to follow those or what's going to happen? And occasionally this turned to some violence. We had the Indian leaders who created an alliance for the purpose of trade and defense. So the Native American groups were gathering themselves together for protection, for trade against these colonists. You have the Puritan Pequot War between 1636 and 1637. Also known as the English versus Pequot, and that's exactly what this war was over, was those 4 points on the previous slide, but also, you know, who's going to be in charge of this land, the natives who have been here or these new people coming in. You have Metacoms, or the AKA King Philip War, between 1675 and 1676. English were persecuting the Native Americans, and the Indians destroyed 1/5 of the English towns in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, killed over 1,000 people. So these colonists are coming over and they're not necessarily taking into account the people that have been there working with them. You had the Pilgrims. Obviously we know about Thanksgiving and different things where the Pilgrims were very, very influential with that, but there was a lot of problems and other things that were going on that weren't really positive for these new colonies. So here we can see King Philip's War. We can see the map of it, Massachusetts majority. But we can see the locations where they went, what they were experiencing, the war they were fighting. And then we also have something called Bacon's Rebellion. And don't worry, it is not about Bacon. Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion in Virginia. It basically was with the friction with Native Americans over land. You have William Berkeley, who's the governor, top of the social pyramid, the one in charge. And he's giving land out, free land out to his friends. And people aren't too happy with that. They're also exempt from paying their taxes. And if you weren't one of those friends, you wouldn't be happy about this. And his friends were very corrupt. The colonists wanted land. The government, William Berkeley and others, said no, because they were just giving it to them friends, not the normal you and I, the people that were coming over for religious freedom and those types of things. And so we started to have some conflict. There was fighting going on with the Native Americans as well. And Nathaniel Bacon said, all the power and sway is got into the hands of the rich. And this is going to kind of set up what we're going to be talking about later on with the colonists eventually leading to revolution. This idea is here of the rich having all the power and control did not sit well with the majority of people who were the colonists that were living in the colonies at this time. So this is Chapter 2, American Experiments from 1521 to 1700. If you have any questions, please reach out. Let me know. Come talk to me, and we can be able to go over this and discuss this together. Have a wonderful day.